Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner, and today I will be joined once again by special guest host Nick. Nick, how's it going?
Hey, good. How are you?
Not too bad. Looking forward to getting into this one. A very, I'll say fun overall, probably episode. One we've looked forward to for a while. But actually, I guess before we jump into it, we do have some patrons to thank. So I want to say thank you to Alec, Minty_drops, Alex, and Cass for joining us over on Patreon.
Yay.
And this month, actually, we're finally starting some of those new bonus projects. We've gotten through the portion of the year. It's very busy with Taylor's wedding and all. So we're finally getting into some of those new bonus projects, in addition to the standard monthly bonus episodes. So Taylor today is actually going to be recording the first of his bonus watch-along series on the show Below Deck. That's going to be for the $5 tier. I am laying the groundwork for my first of the biography-type bonus episodes. It's going to deal with Herman Melville and his maritime experience. And so for all of our patrons, in addition to that new stuff, we hope you continue to enjoy the back catalog of bonus episodes that are already up there.
As a $5 patron, I can say it's worth it.
We're hoping to make it more so in the near future. We are probably going to be having a bit more time coming up here, so we're hoping to pump out some good content, I guess we'll call it. The cursed word.
Yeah.
So speaking of content, what have you been up to recently? What content have you been consuming?
As we touched on last time, it is the college football season.
Right.
Well and truly, and it is wonderful. Last night, Georgia played Kentucky, which I was really worried about that going in. Turns out I need it had been.
Yeah, I checked in relatively early on, and it seemed like they had it pretty well in hand.
Well, at the in the first quarter, Kentucky really just shot themselves in the foot with really bad fouls that cost them big and just killed two of their drives. And I think that pretty much ended it.
At least they didn't have the game wrapped up in a spot to run out the clock and calling run plays instead of kneeling the ball like the Miami Hurricanes did last night,
oh my God.
Resulting in them losing to Georgia Tech.
My grandfather would have been so proud.
They're so rare when you get to watch something on television where the commentators are like, I don't know what's going on, and this is a terrible idea. And then it is a terrible idea when they fumble and lose the game. So yeah, it's a rare thing, but enjoyable.
The announcers last night were talking mad talking about the Kentucky's roughness. They're like, I don't know what that guy was thinking. That was a WWE move on that guy. Well, at one point, one of the players did pile drive the guy when he was already on the ground.
I also managed to watch some baseball yesterday. It was weird turning away from college football to watch baseball. But with the Brewers out, I've latched onto the Phillies just because we interact with a good number of Phillies people. So yeah, they managed to pull one out against the Braves. And then also got to watch Clayton Kershaw get lit up for 6 runs in the first inning. So it was a fun day of sports overall, I guess.
I haven't checked out the Braves a whole lot this year. My wife's super huge into baseball. We haven't been able to watch as much as we wanted this year. She's a Sox fan, though. So,
red or white?
Oh, red.
Okay. I was a White Sox. I still am a White Sox fan, but they were my team. Since I got into baseball, up until through college. I mean, until I realized that I don't actually have to go for this terrible baseball team anymore. It was exciting when they won the World Series in 2005, but they've been pretty terrible most of the time since then.
Yeah, my wife's family's from up that way, or her parents lived in Boston for a while. She was born in Boston. They moved to North Carolina when they were young, but they've been Red Sox fans in their house, super for a long time.
I remember the halcyon days of 2004 when the Red Sox won their first recent World Series, and it was such I was relatively young at the time, middle school, and them being painted as this huge underdog story, finally beating the Yankees, finally winning a World Series after all this time, and then growing up a little bit more and understanding the financial situation and okay, so they still have the third biggest payroll in baseball. But anyway,
Still, it's a good story.
It is. It was. And then they got annoying because they started winning it more. And then everything became Boston. And then you had like The Departed and The Town and all the Boston. Boston became like a franchise.
They went the way of Alabama, and the way Georgia's probably going to be, or kind of already is.
Something about Georgia, though, I don't know, is like less dislikable than if there's a team like a good team I can go for in the SEC. It's probably Georgia. I don't know. It's not quite the same.
Oh yeah, I'm greedy. I want the three-peat, and then next season they could go 0-12. I'll be okay.
I guess in addition to sports, I have been doing other stuff. I've been rereading The Seawolf. For our Beyond the Breakers book club that we just announced. I guess it was last weekend. So rereading that, going back through some notes on that, reading up on Jack London himself. Still not totally sure what we want to do with the book club, like meeting, quote unquote, itself. But it'll be something either like a recorded discussion or, I don't know, playing with the voice chat functions on Discord. We could pretend we're in 12th grade English class again. And everyone can talk about how they felt about the book.
I mean, that would be cool. I haven't got the chance to dive into that one yet.
I'm rereading my copy. I had gotten another because Katie wants to read it. And then I think Taylor's listening to it on audiobook that I think he got for free on Audible. So there's lots of ways to consume it. It's a very good read.
I started reading Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. It's grim.
I read Blood Meridian. I think I read that during like my first semester of graduate school, and I remembered not enjoying it nearly as much as I thought I would. And maybe enjoy is not the right word for what you're supposed to do with that book.
Yeah.
But I didn't like it as much as I expected to. And I think part of that probably was like, I had a lot of other stuff I was thinking about. And so like, it probably wasn't the right thing to be reading at the time. Yeah, it's definitely what I think I need to give a fairer shake to. But yes, I know it is very grim.
McCarthy is also kind of like because he writes in that minimalist style, he demands like extra attention, which I think is on purpose. Like you have to reread things a lot of times to figure out where would the commas be or who's talking, who's he, all that. But that's pretty cool. I don't know if I like it as much as No Country for Old Men yet, which I read a few years ago, I think, and I liked a lot.
Yeah, I need to explore more of his. A lot of those classic authors, modern classic authors. There's too many of them where I've only read like one of their books, so I don't really have a great sense of their authorship. I know we have multiple of his books. I could easily read another one of his.
I listened to The Road on audiobook, and I don't really recommend that. It's very depressing.
That one I know. I think I know the ending.
The movie's pretty good.
That's Viggo Mortensen in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would watch that.
And another book I read a little bit before that, I reread a book, one of my favorite books called Poilu, which is a French memoir of the First World War. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of it, or are you familiar with it?
We actually, when you recommended it, we ordered a copy. So I have a copy of it on our staircase bookshelf.
Yeah, if anyone's listening is interested in the First World War, I think for my money, Poilu is the best memoir of it. And it comes from a super unique perspective, being written by it's written by a guy named Louis Bartas, who was a barrel maker. And when the war started, he was like 35 years old. And he wasn't one of the young guys. He had already done his bit in the army. And he was like militantly socialist and super politically active. And so his attitudes, and he has this wicked sense of humor too that he just interlaces through his books. Mm-hmm. So after the first months of the war, when France has suffered these horrendous casualties and lost all these guys, Bartas finds himself on the front line basically from November 1914 to summer 1917, almost continuously. And just his experiences and just candor and honesty are just super really raw. And most French memoirs from the war don't come from low-ranking frontline soldiers. It just happens. Most of them came from officers or higher enlisted men. So Bartas is kind of an interesting look of just like what the grunts were going through.
And yeah, especially because you mentioned it being from someone who is older. So much of the talk about World War I, for good reason, but it talks about like kind of the wide-eyed innocence of youth being smashed against the horrors of a modern industrial war. And so, yeah, hearing that from an older person who is more experienced in life, not necessarily with that stuff, but I think that would be definitely a cool perspective. So I definitely need to actually crack that open at some point.
Yeah, give me 1 second, because that's cool that you ordered it, though.
Book recommendations pretty quickly. We just kind of snap them up just because we figure it's like we would rather have like tons and tons of books that we haven't read, just because when the mood strikes us, it's there and we can just grab it. Kind of back when I was more into painting, kind of the same rationale I used to order more models. You know, when I feel like painting Dark Eldar, this will just be sitting there for me, even if I never touch it for the next 6 months.
Absolutely. I wanted to share, because you said something about him being older. The first line of the book kind of gives that away. The first paragraph of the book gives that away pretty quickly. And I just kind of wanted to share that. It goes August 2nd, 1914. So he didn't write this post-war either. This is all...
Oh, it's like real time.
He wrote this, and he did edit them afterwards. Mm-hmm. He went through after the war and did edit them. So there is some editorialized, and like afterwards I found out this, but most of the text he wrote in the moment, in the present tense. He had these gross notebooks that he took home whenever he could. So it's pretty stream of consciousness. So it starts August 2nd, 1914, a broiling hot August afternoon, the streets of the village all but deserted. Suddenly a drum roll, probably a traveling merchant setting up shop in the main square, or maybe some acrobats announcing their evening performance. But no, it's not that. When the drums fall silent, we hear the voice of the town clerk, the commissaire. We call this unique embodiment of local authority. So we lend our ears, expecting to hear the rending of a new decree about rabies or keeping the streets clean. Alas, this fellow proceeded to announce the most frightful cataclysm to afflict humanity since the flood. He announced the greatest of all scourges, the source of all evils. He announced a general mobilization, prelude to the war, the accursed, infamous war which forever dishonored our century and blighted the civilization of which we were so proud. So like right off the bat, he's constantly amazed at his country. Like he's always pretty much like just in a state of amazement at everyone's bellicosity.
Yeah, I need to pick that up. Physically pick it up, I mean.
It's a pretty quick read as well, which is helpful.
All right, then. We have an episode to get into. So this episode, because I don't think I mentioned it yet, we are talking about the Confederate submarine Hunley, alternatively sometimes referred to as the H.L. Hunley, CSS Hunley, anything involving the name Hunley. I do want to note, so before we get into the episode, we recorded a bonus episode back in January on the federal blockade of the Confederacy. I think it's called Scott's Pretty Good Snake. We're going to be unlocking that on the main feed, just because it does give some pretty interesting context to some of the stuff we're going to be talking about. I know we're going to get into discussions of the blockade, since we'll be talking about some of the stuff we'll be talking about has a lot to do with the blockade. But for a little bit more focus, some of the specific research we did on the blockade as a whole, you can check those out. We'll be unlocking that right around the time that we release this episode. So with that, I will let Nick take the helm.
All right. So before we get to the Civil War and the Hunley, because this is such a seminal submarine or craft in submarine history, I thought we should go back to the beginning.
Yes.
All the way back to the Renaissance. And a guy named Leonardo da Vinci. You might have heard of him.
The guy from the Assassin's Creed games?
Yes, that guy. So Da Vinci is pretty famous for tons of stuff. One of them was designing machines that were way ahead of his time. Now, very few of them were built. He designed things like helicopters, flying machines, all kinds of stuff. And even though most of it never got built, he was always publishing the blueprints, basically, of these designs. And one of those things he designed was a submersible craft. However, pretty uniquely among the things he designed, Da Vinci showed an attitude that was pretty reflective of attitudes regarding submarines all the way up into the 20th century. And he considered them basically too dangerous to share how to make them. He saw them as pretty uniquely evil, which we would continue to see people view these machines as. Regarding his method on subs, he said, "I do not publish or divulge my method because of the evil nature of men who would practice assassinations at the bottom of the sea by breaking the ships in their lower parts and sinking them together with the crews who are on them."
So from that quote, I guess it's pretty obvious. He means, like, you mean too dangerous in the sense of what it would do to warfare, basically.
Correct.
making it this, low, dirty affair, unfair, I guess you might call it, rather than like too dangerous to use, too dangerous to be in.
Correct. If he meant the first one, he might have been even more forward thinking, but we will get there. So this attitude was, again, like I said, pretty reflective of seeing this kind of concept as just being unfair and dirty. And like, you don't have a good fight if you just blow someone up from beneath or wreck apart their keel from beneath them and they just sink. That's no good. So a term used for these kinds of this concept of machine were infernal machines, which is a term that was usually formerly used to describe gunpowder weapons until gunpowder became ubiquitous.
Right.
Which is the way it goes, right? Something comes out and it's scary, and then we use it for a while and it's fine. So while Da Vinci never divulged or provided any kind of designs for a submersible boat, people still kept thinking about it. But it wouldn't be until the 18th century when the next big concrete step would happen. And that brings us to the American Revolution. Yay.
Heck yeah.
Insert eagle screech.
I can do that. Or whatever bird it is they actually use for when they have to do an eagle sound.
Yeah, because actual eagles sound like terrible.
Yeah.
I forget. It's some kind of hawk, I think.
I'll just use the regular eagle sound and everyone will be like, what? What was that?
Yes. So in 1775, we come to a man named David Bushnell, who was an American patriot and an engineer. And he designed a craft called the Turtle, which was the first operational submersible craft. Now, the Turtle was a wooden one-man craft shaped like a pear. It was made out of wood and had iron bands around it, so it looked kind of like a pear-shaped barrel. It used two propellers, which are hand cranked, like one on the back and one on the top. And it was one of the first vessels to use propellers, actually, for propulsion.
So one guy is operating both of these cranks?
Yeah. I don't think he used them simultaneously. I think one was going forward.
I was thinking like a patting your head, rubbing your belly situation of like you can't do both of them.
I think one is for going forward and one is for going up and down.
I got you.
It also had ballast tanks operated by foot pedals to control buoyancy. So you would just pump the pedal and water would come in or out and you would go up or down.
Nice.
I imagine the fact that it was made of wood also helped its buoyancy.
I can't imagine getting in a fully wooden barrel, basically, and intending to take it just like entirely underwater. I don't know. Mr. Bushnell was built different.
Well, he didn't actually have to get into it.
Oh, of course. Well,
well, I imagine he got into it when he was building it, but he was not the guy at the helm when the Turtle attempted to sink when the Turtle attempted to be the first submersible craft to destroy an enemy ship. On September 6, 1776, the Turtle, piloted by a sergeant named Ezra Lee, attempted to sink the HMS Eagle in New York Harbor using a mine with 150 pounds of gunpowder. The idea was to dive under the ship and using a drill attached to the top propeller to fix the mine to the ship. And a clockwork mechanism was to detonate the bomb. However, for one reason or another, Lee was not able to attach the mine, possibly to the curvature of the ship, or possibly because of a copper lining along the hull.
Oh, right.
He wasn't able to attach the bomb, and the British spotted him and lowered a boat, and he decided to hightail it out of there. And the bomb went off harmlessly in the bay later.
Okay. I guess I'm a little bit surprised that this contraption, they're like trusting it with just like an enlisted guy rather than like, I don't know, like a lieutenant or something. But that's impressive, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like ranks have pretty much stayed the same, but I think relative authority for some of these ranks might have changed over time.
I remember because we had to do like a speed run. Well, we didn't have to. We chose to, I guess. A speed run through the history of submarines when we, in part one of the Lusitania. And I remember I didn't really read up on the details like you had here, but of just kind of the frustration of having a successful like operational submarine, but not being able to weaponize it effectively to do what they ultimately wanted it to do.
Yeah, as we'll see later, and making them combat effective really is the challenge.
Mm-hmm.
The Turtle also attempted to sink the HMS Cerberus in Long Island Sound. It also failed in that.
Mm.
So I mentioned earlier the Turtle used a mine. So real quick, we ought to do a sidebar on torpedoes/mines. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about torpedoes in this time period, we're really talking about what we would call mines today. Right. This is kind of similar how prior to and during World War I, the word mine did not mean an explosive trap like we're thinking of. It referred to the act of tunneling under the enemy, literally undermining. Mining with miners, literally undermining the enemy.
Who were probably, some of them were underage, so they were probably also miners.
And you fill the tunnel up and blow it up.
Mm-hmm.
So similarly, the term torpedo did not refer to a underwater missile. It referred to basically a little bomb. And these 19th century's torpedoes could be used in a few ways. Like with the Turtle, they could use a clockwork timer to blow up the charge. So you'd go up and plant it somewhere and run off. Or you could explode the torpedo with an electric signal through a copper wire. So your classic, like, push the button, blow up the bomb.
That seems so high tech, like, for the time to have, like, a button operated explosive device.
Yeah, I think they just found some way to send an electric charge through it. And just, I don't know if they just tap something together or what they did, but
that's cool.
Finally, the torpedo could be configured to explode on contact, like a modern naval mine, which would become the most common use. And I'll get a little bit more into the delivery systems later.
I did just want to throw in an etymological note here. It is funny because, like, you talked about the torpedo and how the meaning has changed, and like the literal name torpedo, it literally means something that sits there, not moving. Like related to the word torpor, like Torpor. And so it's just so funny how, like, over time, like you talked about with mines, how words are sort of like distance from their original literal meaning to the point where they even mean the opposite. Now we would think of a torpedo that doesn't move is a defective torpedo.
Yeah. Or a mine.
How Mitch Hedberg has the joke about, like, the escalator being out of order and, like, escalator now stairs. And same thing here. It's like torpedo now mine.
So despite the shortcomings, the Turtle was encouraging to those who saw the offensive potential of submarines. George Washington was a fan, writing a letter to Jefferson. One accident or another was always interfering. I then thought, and still think now, that it was an effort of genius.
So impressing all the right people, basically.
Yeah. They were pretty excited about it. But for the next major iteration, though, we go across the sea to Europe, but we don't go visit a European. We're going to hang out with Robert Fulton.
Oh, nice.
So Robert Fulton is mainly known as the steamboat guy.
Mm-hmm.
Inventor famous for steamboats with his boat, the Clermont. Fulton was the first to establish a line of commercial passenger ships. But that was in 1807.
I'm going to jump in here because I know the steamboat mafia will get us for this.
Yes.
Is that the Clermont is a misnomer, and he actually referred to it as the North River Steamboat.
Oh.
So I'm just putting it out there. I don't care. Doesn't bother me whatsoever. Steamboat folks, we hear you.
Don't come after me.
Your concerns are valid. But anyway, sorry, that's not the point. Continue.
My main resource for this is, I should have said this earlier. My biggest resource for this was The H.L. Hunley, The Secret Hope of the Confederacy by Tom Chaffin, or possibly Chaffin. So blame him.
Well, and that's the thing though, is like that's what it's called in like every source, and like everyone calls it the Claremont, and then like you read about it and it's like, oh, he never actually called it the Claremont. He called it the North River steamboat. But anyway, it's pedantic.
Where did Claremont come from?
and he's dead, so who cares?
But that was in 1807. What's less known is that before he was a steamboat guy, he was almost the submarine guy. So the turn of the 19th century found Fulton in France, where he was working on a submarine boat, which he hoped to sell to the French and or British government. What he made was called the Nautilus, or the Nautilus, I guess, if you want to put the extra syllable in there. The Nautilus looked more like what we would consider a submarine than the Turtle. It was more cylindrical shaped. It was 21 feet long. It had a hull sheathed in copper. It's not just wood. Likewise, it had a propeller in the back and also one on the bottom to help on the bottom near the bow. And weirdly, it featured 2 masts and a collapsible sail.
That's cool.
It is pretty cool. There's an illustration of it in Chaffin's book, and it's pretty steampunky looking.
So in terms of the body, you mentioned it was coated in copper. So it has a wooden frame that's just clad in copper, basically?
That seems to be what it was, yeah.
I still wouldn't want to, but I think I'd be more likely to get into that than the one that's just made of wood.
Yeah, for sure. I had written down how many guys were supposed to be in it, but I might have accidentally deleted it. Anyway, it was for 3 to 5 guys, if I remember right, in here, cranking.
3 to 5 guys cranking it in the submarine.
Yeah. Looking at the picture, I don't know how they'd use the sail. It looks really awkward with the top of the vessel rounded off. I wouldn't want to be up on top of it trying to sail it, but some guys did. Well, someone tried it anyway, because the Nautilus was tested in the Seine River and then at Brest. It is the Seine, right?
I think I say the Seine.
I say the Seine. It's okay. We saved them in World War I. We can say whatever we want.
Exactly.
It was tested in the Seine River and then at Brest. During the Brest trial, the Nautilus is credited for sinking a sloop allegedly provided by Napoleon himself, who was impressed with it. The book didn't really say specifically on how it supposedly sank this. I assume with a mechanical mind, like earlier. But despite people being impressed, neither the French nor British offered what Fulton considered adequate compensation for the Nautilus. And he left Europe in a huff.
What year was this happening?
This is right 1799, 1800. So right at the turn of the century.
So like both Napoleon and the British have like a lot of things going on. So maybe they forget about the submarine project, maybe. But no, I like how these things always come down to compensation. Robert Fulton, he feels like he's got a good product. This is like an episode of Shark Tank, basically. And he just wants his correct investment.
Yeah, he certainly does. He doesn't get it. He gets mad and he leaves. And he goes and does his steamboat thing, which makes him the money he wants.
I guess we'd call that serendipity, maybe. And I think that if submarine technology had been invented in the Napoleonic Wars, it would make the Master and Commander books like a lot. It'd be a very different animal.
Oh, man. Just the alternate history that would come from that. Just get Turtle Dove on that,
Yeah, that's a great idea, actually.
He needs ideas.
You can't just give people AK-47s all the time.
I like some of Turtle Dove's work. That one was super wacky.
I actually, on Harry Turtle Dove, I read quite a bit of his books when I was...
I read a fair amount.
I liked his Darkness series was really good. It's like a fantasy... It's just like a pretty much blow-by-blow allegory for World War II. Like, literally, you can match up the different nations to the different real ones. And then, like, instead of tanks, they ride, like, these armored behemoths. Instead of planes, they have dragons. Instead of fighting for oil, they're fighting over cinnabar, I think, because the dragons need that to, like, spit fire. I really enjoyed those when I was a kid, and actually, like, it helped me learn quite a bit about World War II in terms of filing stuff into different categories. But his like actual alternate history stuff, I never enjoyed quite as much. Like Guns of the South, and his the one like his American fronts. I forget what the series is called, but it's like
that's Southern Victory is the name of that series.
Yeah, like the alternate history, like World War I, stuff like that.
Actually, I liked it. I liked those ones. Okay, I thought just because I thought the scenario was interesting, and just extrapolating if the South had won, like the terrible thing, like it is a worse world.
Yeah, and I think that's the good point that those books make is that like it doesn't lead to good things.
Like imagine the Battle of the Somme, but in Kentucky. Not fun.
No.
He also did a series where aliens invade in the middle of World War II.
Yeah, I knew about. I don't think I ever read any of those.
I like that one because it doesn't just kind of do a blow by blow of World War II. He has to come up with new things to happen.
Throw in a variable.
Anyway, cool tangent. After Fulton, I have one other prominent guy I want to talk about real quick. And it's a Bavarian named Wilhelm Bauer. And in 1850, he designed and built the Brandtaucher. The Brandtaucher was intended to break the Danish blockade of northern German ports during the First War of Schleswig. Schleswig. I wrote it wrong. I think my computer replaced the big B letter that Germans use.
It doesn't recognize the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein.
No, it does not.
Politically or grammatically.
No, not at all. So the Brandtaucher was intended to break that Danish blockade, but the war ended before it could be deployed. Brandtaucher took another step towards that classic submarine design we all know. It was 27 feet long and shaped like a sausage.
Of course.
Of course. Get the Unterwasserwurst. It had a little conning tower with little portholes to let in light, and basically looked just like a fat miniature submarine that we would recognize as a submarine.
How does a Bavarian get into this, I wonder? Isn't he kind of far from where he'd be using this?
That's a good point. Other people he might have been aware of other literatures of people who had been working on the concept, because for people who were interested, there were letters and articles and things, especially when we get up to 1850 when he's working. But maybe he was, German unification guy, because that happened.
I would imagine this coming from someone who's from like Hamburg or something, but
yeah, somewhere on the sea.
Yeah.
So the Brandtaucher initially tested well, diving upwards of 50 feet. During a dive in 1851, the sub sank to the bottom, and after sitting for 5 hours, Bauer and the other two crew bailed and escaped, which must have been horrifying.
So, like, presumably, like, shallow enough that not huge issue escaping. I mean, probably still terrifying, but...
Imagine sitting down there for that long, too, and just thinking, what do we do?
Well, sitting in a submarine for, like, 5 hours at the bottom and, like, escaping seems like a pretty unique experience.
Yeah. Submarines generally don't have a high survivor rate when
right.
things go wrong. Ask the Kursk.
Mm-hmm.
But after that mishap, Bauer didn't let it get him down. He created the Seetoffel, or the Sea Devil, which was basically a larger version of the previous boat, carried a crew of 15. Seetoffel completed over 100 dives. But during a dive demonstration at the celebration of the coronation of Tsar Alexander II, it sank. And the crew managed to escape this time as well. But that was pretty much the end of the Seetoffel's career. And I go all over all of this basically to show that in the 1860s, submarine construction was not a new thing. People had been advocating for their usefulness and trying to make them practical for more than 70 years at that point. But no one had ever sank an enemy ship, which brings us to Q Dixie, 1861.
I'm only using Union Civil War songs on the background.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't put loser music on our show.
So let me get my bearings here because I'm shifting gears a bit. Because I wrote go over the blockade briefly, but that's all I wrote.
In that bonus episode that I'll release, we talk about kind of the there's not even like great consensus historically over like, was the Union blockade this like lockdown, anaconda constricting the South to death, or was it, in one of the articles it talks about it as the describing it as like a sieve. Basically, it was easy enough to get through that like they were able to get goods in and out, but like materially on the ground, yes, like by the end of the war, the South is suffering pretty badly from not being able to get the goods that they need, whereas like luxury goods are still able to access a lot of these places, because for a lot of these smugglers, like they're still making money off of the stuff, even though like you can't eat lace bonnets. And so like big picture wise, people are suffering pretty badly, even though individual instances of the blockade being broken or infiltrated do exist.
There was a big psychological effect. It instilled a huge sense of urgency in the South to do something about this, because we got cotton that we need to get to Europe. And the South did something pretty dumb in the Civil War to try to get England and France, kind of get them more on their side, as they put an embargo on their own cotton, figuring that if France and Britain couldn't get some of that sweet cotton, they might intervene. Unfortunately for them, 1860 had been a surplus year, and warehouses in France and England were full of cotton. So they could live for a while.
I'm reminded of like in during Thomas Jefferson's presidency, like in kind of the precursor time to the War of 1812, and how the same idea of like, well, if we shut off our goods from both of them, maybe it will stop the fighting and it'll be good for us. And both Britain and France are like, okay, whatever. We will just go elsewhere. And just kind of an overestimation of the value that was being placed on American goods in Europe at the time.
And the way it kind of ended up working out was their surplus cotton lasted long enough for the war to become explicitly about slavery. And after that point, it became politically untenable for them to show support for the South.
Right.
Because both of those nations were pretty heavily anti-slavery, despite how racist they were.
Absolutely not mutually exclusive things, as we've discussed before on the show.
With the Quakers.
Right.
So that's the sitch. Also, before I talk the Civil War, I always want to, we all know this, I'm sure everyone listening knows this as well, but I always feel obligated to say unequivocally that the Civil War was absolutely 100% about the expansion and the preservation of American slavery. As we'll talk about later, there's different reasons why certain individuals fought for one other reason or another. But the goal of the polity that was the Confederate States was race-based slavery. Always want to acknowledge that.
And if you don't want to believe us,
believe them.
Read what the Confederate government said about state legislatures and the Confederate government stuff. Read what they said about why the Confederacy existed.
Just check out my own states. I'm from the OG Confederate state,
Right, yeah, the original, yeah.
We have the inside of the state house has the Articles of Secession in marble on the wall, on the inside, which is deeply upsetting. But just listen to our secession thing; they're pretty clear. But I always feel like it's important to say that, especially because this story's kind of fun, and it might kind of come off like we're rooting for these guys a little bit, but the cause is absolutely rotten. So with that out the way, though, we're going to talk mostly about the naval situation, obviously. So from the outset of the war, the biggest problem for the Confederate Navy was it didn't really exist.
That sucks.
The U.S. Navy had 90 warships to the Confederacy's 10. So they had a 10-to-1 disparity here, or 9-to-1 disparity here. And to combat this, the Confederate government approved the practice of privateering.
Classic.
If this seems anachronistic, it kind of is. We think privateers, you think, the age of sail and pirates from the 1600s and stuff. And that's pretty accurate, because by the mid-19th century, privateering as an official practice had fallen way off. By 1858, Britain, France, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire had all signed a treaty banning privateering. The United States, though, did not sign. Classic us.
Yeah.
Figuring that they may need to use asymmetric naval warfare in the future. And so, 3 years later, the Confederacy faces the same exact problem with the U.S. Navy. So in April 1861, Confederate President Jefferson Davis issues a proclamation offering letters of marque and reprisal, which just seems so out of the century.
Yeah, this is something that you imagine happening in like the 1600s, 1700s.
Absolutely.
And you're like, oh, this is the mid 1860s.
Yeah, no, good old Jeff Davis is writing these. And this gave civilians the opportunity to arm private ships and capture or destroy enemy vessels and earn money for doing so.
Nice.
They had hoped that the financially inclined people, the citizens, would step up and take this. However, the calls for privateers ended up being pretty disappointing for the Confederates overall, and they ended up commissioning their own merchant ships, like the previous star of the show, CSS Alabama. However, the promise of money for destroying enemy ships still attracted a few enterprising individuals, including, finally, the human star of this story, Horace Lawson Hunley. Hunley was originally from Tennessee, but he moved to New Orleans at a young age. His father had a really sentimental attachment to New Orleans, as he had been a veteran of the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, the one that we fought after the war was over.
Right.
But we won it, and Hunley's dad felt like he wanted to return to New Orleans and grow up and raise his family there. So that's where Horace. That's where Horace turned up. I'm going to think of the Horace Heresy every time I say his name. It's spelled differently.
This whole inversion of classic naval thought, we could refer to this all as the Horace Heresy, I guess.
Yes.
Also, I was going to add, but I think my connection cut out when I was trying to add this. I was going to add, I like the way that it was phrased as the call for privateers went kind of unanswered, but the whole basically bounty for destroying enemy ships was a lot more interesting. And it's like, yeah, I can imagine that being like, serving on a naval vessel sounds like it sucks, but could probably think up a device that could sink a ship.
If you don't have to capture it.
Sounds a lot easier.
I don't want to babysit all these men. So Hunley was a lawyer, practiced law in New Orleans, but he was a guy who didn't mind dipping his toe in new things. He did some planting, which meant he owned a plantation that he rarely visited. Like a lot of the planter class at that time, actually. Mm-hmm. Most of the super rich ones didn't even live on their plantations. They would have these mega estates or multiple places, and they would just basically pay a guy to run it, and they would just get all the money.
And I'm sure that they had no idea what was going on those plantations.
Yeah, absolutely no. Which brings me to a guy I want to talk about who's not super, super important to the Hunley story, but he was important to Hunley's life and gives an interesting perspective of someone in the South that we don't usually get a perspective from. And that's Hunley's brother-in-law, Robert Barrow, who was married to Hunley's sister. Barrow was one of the richest guys in the South at the time, owned huge plantations. He estimated that he had upwards of 700 slaves. He wasn't quite sure, though.
That's bleak.
It is bleak. But Barrow was extremely pro-slavery, as you might expect. But he was also extremely anti-secession. Mm-hmm. And because he saw secession as leading to the financial ruin of the South in general and him in particular. Mm-hmm. I bring this up because Chaffin kind of brought it up, made an interesting deal about it, about Hunley being a guy with a foot in two worlds. Mm-hmm. Because he's working in New Orleans. He's doing work in the hustle and bustle of the city. He's doing stuff at the custom house where a lot of young guys and stuff, or urban class guys, are doing work. And a lot of those guys were very opportunistic and very pro-succession. This was a big opportunity. And the other foot was this way more conservative bent that he's pulled in this other direction. And keeping those in mind kind of gave me a bigger picture or fuller picture of what was going on societally at the time. And because it wasn't a monolith.
We got into a little bit of that in the blockade episode, talking because that focuses a lot on business people at the time in the South, and how there was this huge swath of Southern society, your business people, who they definitely don't want a war. Their motivations for that are not necessarily what we'd call pure. They don't want to lose money. It's all financial. They're benefiting from slavery. They just don't want all these these hotheads to ruin this good thing they've got going. I think, like you said, the nuance is important. It does add to the story, knowing that this isn't a block of people who are all in this for the same reason.
1861, Hunley's boss at the custom house, Francis Hatch, hooked him up with a gun running scheme, which I found super interesting. That in the summer of 1861, Horace Hunley found himself off the coast of Cuba on a ship called the Adela, awaiting to meet up with a British ship to get guns from them. Now, the meetup was unsuccessful. The ships missed each other. He came back empty-handed. But this episode gives Hunley kind of a taste of the possibilities that he could take advantage of in this new state of war that he's found himself in. Sometime at the point before the fall 1861, we're not exactly sure when, Hunley met two men named James McClintock and Baxter Watson. All three of these guys would claim to be the main submarine idea person. Odds are, though, McClintock was the most important of the three. McClintock was from Ohio, and he had been a riverboat pilot and an engineer. He was a completely self-taught engineer as well. So he was always tinkering with stuff. And right at the beginning of the Civil War, he and his buddy Baxter Watson got a gig making bullets for the Confederate Army. So we're actually not really sure where the idea of the submarine came from. There were articles floating around in the papers. McClintock and Watson claimed to have been unaware of these, and they claim to have just come up with the idea.
That was something I did bracket in this article, was saying, it's interesting to note that McClintock stated to Northern officials after the war that the design of the submarine and the idea for it was completely his own. He declared that he knew nothing of the work of David Bushnell or Robert Fulton.
I think he's a big fat liar.
I think especially for someone who was an engineer, someone who you would think would be relatively well read on those things, but I don't know.
Yeah, a naval engineer at that. I mean, working on the rivers, you'd think. But we don't know exactly when the idea came about. But by the fall of 1861, the idea was there. And they began getting investments. And this is really where Hunley comes in. Hunley at this part of the project was mainly the money guy.
Okay.
He had that rich brother-in-law that he thought would give him money for this, but ended up not. But that was okay, because he still found funds anyway. Between the fall of 1861 and the spring of 1862, the guys oversaw the construction of what would become the CSS Pioneer. The Pioneer was made of plates of iron taken from boilers, which were attached to an overall iron frame.
Why don't they just make the whole ship out of the boiler?
Pioneer was I can't say C words today. Pioneer was cigar-shaped, 35 feet long. It had a 4-foot beam, and it would have a 2 to 3 man crew. It was completely built and tested in Lake Pontchartrain for its gentle environs. A man named John K. Scott, who was a riverboat captain, was recruited to pilot the boat. And two possible targets were the USS New London and Calhoun, which were in Lake Pontchartrain and kind of making a menace of themselves. Now, at this time, Early 1862, New Orleans is still in Confederate hands, but the looming threat of the Union Navy is on the horizon. But the Union Navy still already has these two little gunboats and like Pontchartrain that are causing problems. So a few more tech specs on Pioneer. It had a barometer for gauging depth, but nothing to indicate speed, which led to, on one occasion, the boat getting stuck in the mud at the bottom and the guys cranking away at the propeller and not moving and not realizing they weren't moving.
Oh, that sucks.
Eventually they got it dislodged, though. Another thing, it was leaky. It had these gaskets, these rubber gaskets for preventing the leak, but they weren't perfect. It had balance problems. So if you shifted a little bit while you're in this thing, it was liable to go off keel. So you can imagine accidentally like shifting your weight, or God forbid, you throw your back against the hull and it just turns upside down.
It's like literally what I imagined the Titan submersible being.
Awful. Despite this, though, Hunley and Company deemed it worthy enough to apply for a letter of marque, which they got in March of 1861, making the CSS Pioneer the only one of these submarines we're going to talk about that actually got a letter of marque and was thus the only one entitled to the CSS prefix.
Okay, that helps with the naming issue.
However, though, April 1862, the Union is coming up the Mississippi. They're about to capture New Orleans. And so the guys, to their great heartbreak, scuttle this Pioneer in the New Basin Canal in April 1862 and immediately hightailed it to the next port city, Mobile, where they would have to start again.
This was another detail here from this article from the Virginia Historical Magazine that I thought was interesting, and I hope I'm not stepping on your toes that you were going to mention this. It talks about the issues with the control, talking about them being compelled to scuttle the craft, talking about McClintock. He felt it would be better to destroy all evidence of his work rather than let it fall into the hands of David G. Farragut's advancing fleet. Actually, the vessel was discovered by the North, and detailed plans of it were sent to Washington. But
yes,
little notice was taken of the information.
They also sold it for scrap.
That's great. I think that's a fun ending to the story. Like I could imagine a movie kind of in the vein of like Burn After Reading, something like that. Where there's this whole like caper of like trying to hide this secret device they're working on, and they finally like destroy it and they have to flee town, and then it gets discovered and is like thrown into a scrap heap, and it gets like filed away in some cabinet, and no one.
It's just like, that was weird. This is the drawing that the Union engineers made.
That's cool.
Of the quote rebel submarine. That's what they called it. One engineer claimed actually that 2 enslaved people were killed in the submarine and drowned. That's uncorroborated by anybody else. And I'm kind of disinclined to believe that happened. Not because the Confederates were incapable of that kind of cruelty, because they were. But they also weren't shy about saying what they did to black people. Apparently, no one said they found bones in it. Or maybe they meant that they drowned in an earlier sinking or something. Maybe not.
It strikes me as kind of like the whole, are you familiar with the concept of like the Black Legend, like the Spanish Empire?
That they were like uniquely bad.
It strikes me as something where it's like you don't necessarily have to like invent stuff to show that this was a cruel and brutal like situation here. Like there's plenty of documented and corroborated stuff to show that. So yeah.
I forgot to plug in my computer.
Oh no.
I was looking at my battery. I was like, why is it so low? I thought when my thing's plugged in, I turned around, the cord's on the wall.